Today I'd like to answer the question: can I get COVID-19 twice? I'm on the medical advisory team at our school, and I often field questions from members in the community. This question came up after we had a week-long fall break. One of the teachers had a confirmed case of COVID-19 in the summer, and she traveled out of state for fall break, and was once again exposed to COVID-19, and wondered if she was immune and could return to school, or if she needed to quarantine. I told her that she needed to quarantine for 14 days, and here's why. Yes, you can get COVID-19 more than once. There have been a few small case studies that have come out that show this to be true. Let me explain them. On August 24th, researchers in Hong Kong confirmed a 33-year-old man was infected a second time with COVID-19 more than 4 months after his first bout. The first infection caused cough, fever, sore throat, and headache, and symptoms lasted about 3 days. COVID was confirmed with a PCR test, and he subsequently had 2 negative COVID tests 24 hours apart to confirm recovery from the illness. Then 142 days later, as he was returning to Hong Kong, he received routine screening and was found to be positive again with a PCR test. At this time he was asymptomatic for COVID-19. There are also other reports from Belgium, the Netherlands, Ecuador, and now the United States about reinfection that has occurred 3 weeks to 4.5 months after the first documented COVID-19 infection. In each of these cases reported in the medical literature, scientists were able to compare the virus gene line by line, called genetic sequencing. They found that the viruses were slightly different, which proved that this was indeed a separate and different infection and not just a lingering infection that could cause a prolonged positive test result. The cases in the U.S. and Ecuador are especially interesting, because the second infection was more severe than the first. Our case was reported in The Lancet, and I will provide a link in the description. But the case report discusses a 25-year-old healthy man living in Nevada. He had diarrhea, he recovered and his symptoms resolved, and he had 2 negative PCR tests documenting his recovery. The second infection of COVID-19 began in early June with similar symptoms, but this time he also developed a low oxygen level and shortness of breath and needed to be admitted to the hospital for oxygen. Well, what about antibodies? Aren't they protective? Well, yes, normally shortly after we're infected with a virus, our bodies will recognize the virus and knock it out quickly if we're re-exposed. But unfortunately, RNA viruses like influenza and SARS-CoV-19, or the virus that causes COVID-19, make errors as they make copies of themselves when they reproduce. Millions of times these errors can eventually cause enough changes to the virus, and then we may not be able to fight off the slightly modified new virus when we're exposed to it. This leads to a new infection. To compare this to something we're more familiar with, this is what happens with influenza or the flu. The whole reason you need to be vaccinated every year against influenza, that because it's constantly making genetic changes that alters the virus ever so slightly over the course of a year. Some viruses mutate and change more rapidly than others, and we're still learning about SARS too. So at the end of the day, there are still so many things we don't know, but I'm hopeful that most people that get re-exposed to SARS-CoV-19 won't have a severe infection. But we'll just have to see. We have limitations in routine testing, especially for asymptomatic people, and this has limited our ability to know how many possible reinfections are happening. But it does stress the need for us to continue to protect ourselves even if we've had a COVID-19 illness in the past. Until we know more about the longevity and effectiveness of immunity, it's safer to assume we're still vulnerable after infection, especially if we encounter a different strain of the virus, and you most certainly can pass this one to someone else during your second infection, even if you're asymptomatic. Therefore, even if someone has already been infected, it's still useful to remain cautious and follow public health guidelines to minimize the chance of reinfection. So please, continue to wear masks on social distance and wash your hands. And thanks for joining me.